and welcome to the third and final video about how to make a breezy summer dress using Vogue 1348. I cut a lot of corners to lighten up the dress, and then I added a complicated twist at the shoulder, but it should be easy from here on out. Let me show you how to finish it up. I have a 22-inch invisible zipper that I've unzipped, and I'm rolling out the teeth and pressing it flat. This makes it easier to get close to the coil when I'm sewing. I pinned the zipper onto the dress with the stop about a 1/4 inch from the top edge. I'm using an invisible zipper foot to sew it at 5/8 inch. I'm keeping tension on the fabric and zipper in front of and behind the feed dogs. This way the burnout satin will feed smoothly. I'm not pulling it through the machine, I'm letting the feed dogs do their job, and I'm just holding the fabric steady. I've sewn as far as I can, about a 1/4 inch from the back notch. I'll mark the zipper where it should meet the notch on the other side and where I need to stop sewing, so it's even on both sides. Now I lay the dress out to pin the zipper to the other side. This way I don't end up with an unintentional twist anywhere. I put another piece of blue painter's tape on my machine to mark the 5/8 inch seam allowance on the other side. Now I'm sewing the zipper in from the neck down just like I did on the other side, and ending at the first mark. I'm also going to sew the seam allowance to the very edge of the zipper tape to keep it nice and tidy. Then switch to a zipper foot and sew right up next to the zipper stitch line, to just past the zipper. Then I can switch back to a regular foot to finish sewing the center back seam. I pinked the edges and pressed the back seam open and the zipper flat. I'm getting pretty excited about this dress. I had a lot of doubts in the beginning. Alright, let's get the pockets in there. I'm sewing the pocket bags with a 1/4 inch seam allowance at a 1/2 inch seam allowance on the dress sides. Once all 4 pocket bags are sewn, I can press them all flat and then toward the pocket. Now pin the side seams together with the pocket bags and seams pushed out of the way. Sew the side seam, leaving the space between the notches open. I pinked the edges and then pressed the side seams open, making sure the pocket opening is butted together and the bag is pushed to the front. I pinned the pocket in place and then pinned around the edge of the pocket bag. There's a little bit of overhang because the back pocket is offset a bit. I do this so I don't have to snip the seam allowance under the pocket bag like the directions show. That's just asking for trouble on this delicate fabric. Plus, I like that the side seam stays balanced with the seam allowance open on both sides at the top. So now I can sew around the edge of the pocket bag just up to where it meets the stitching of the shell fabric. I sewed one more line of stitches for safety and then pinked the edge. Now I can pin the side seam of the bodice. I'm sewing about 1 inch into the facing and down the side seam. Press the seam flat, then use a pin to baste the pleat close down to the lower thread mark. I snipped into the seam allowance for the curve just up to the stay stitching. I don't want to snip too far because the fabric will continue to unravel. Then press the seam open and form the pleat. Pin the pleat edges and sew them down on each side of the seam. Then pink the raw edges that are fraying everywhere. I guess I should make the stays for the pleats since I don't have an underlining to sew them to. I want something really thin that won't fray and isn't too stretchy. I have this super lightweight mesh that should work perfectly. I cut a 2 3/4 inch strip and hand sewed one edge to the zipper tape. I spread the dress and pleats so they were flat and shaped correctly, then pinned the mesh onto the seam allowances and top of the pleat. Then I backstitched the mesh in place. Then trim the extra mesh so there's no overlap at the seams. Repeat this for all of the sections, then try it on and make sure it's not pulling anywhere. It should hold the pleats up smoothly without adding extra bulk. Now onto the lining. Stay stitch the center front lining above the notch, then increase your stitch length a little and ease stitch the bust curve of the front side linings above the notch. I'm pinning the princess seams on the front and pulling the bobbin thread of the ease stitch until the side bust curve fits nicely into the center front piece. I also pinned the back princess seams and I'm sewing them all at 5/8 inch. Then pink the edges and press them open. Pin the front and back linings to the facings. These are both on curves, so you'll want to follow the stitch line, not the edge of the fabric, as you're pinning. Sew and then pink the edges. Then press them down. Now I can pin and sew the side seams. Then pink and press open. I have only one panel of the petticoat cut. I'm sewing just part of the short ends together to be the center back below the zipper. Then I increase my stitch length to about 3.5 millimeters and sew the top edge without back tacking. The bobbin thread is usually easier to pull, so I'm pulling that and evening out the gathers across the petticoat layer. Then pin to the dress lining and continue evening out the gathers until they look pretty balanced. Sew the ruffle, and then press just a little past the seam allowance to flatten the gathers. I ran it through my serger to finish the edge, then top stitch at the lining. I'm deviating from the pattern instructions just a bit for the last few ruffles of the petticoat and the dress hem. I cut another layer of satin for the petticoat that's 7 inches long and the same width as the first layer. I serged the short edges since I'm not worried about bulkiness anymore, and I sewed them together into a circle. And for the bottom layer I cut 2 pieces of chiffon that are 6 inches tall by the width of the fabric. For the chiffon pieces I don't want to serge the edges, so I'm doing French seams. To do that I sew one seam back to back, press it open, then trim the seam allowance down to about 1/8 of an inch. Fold it along the seam and sew again at about 1/4 inch to enclose the edge, then press it to one side. I'm going to hem the chiffon ruffle, so I'm doing one stitch about 1/4 inch from the edge, keeping tension on the fabric behind and in front of the needle. I'm not pulling it, just keeping it taut. Then I can fold it twice using that stitch as a guide and make a tight little rolled hem. Now to ruffle the chiffon. This is super easy because it's so lightweight. I just set my machine at its longest stitch length and increase the tension. It pretty much ruffles on its own. Now I can pin that into the satin circle, spreading the ruffles evenly, and then sew it down. Press the gathers at the seam allowance, and then run it through a serger to clean the edge. Top stitch the seam allowance up so the gathers hang freely. Now I can pin this into my dress. My satin lining is facing toward my body, so it's nicer to wear, but for the lower petticoat ruffle I want the satin facing out. So I'm pinning the ruffle face onto the back of the lining satin. These layers are the same size, so no gathering stitch is needed. Just sew, serge, and top stitch the seam allowance up. Then give it a good press. I want a little bitty hem on the dress just like I did on the chiffon ruffle, so I'm sewing close to the edge to stabilize it. It frayed a lot, so I'm trimming the extra yarns down. And then fold it over twice to enclose the raw edge and stitch close to the folded edge. Then press. The back lining is still open at the zipper, so I'm marking the 5/8 inch seam allowance at center back. Use pinking shears to trim down the raw edge. Then pin the lining onto the zipper tape. Check to make sure it's not pulling anywhere before sewing it in place. This dress ended up nice, but the fit was a challenge since everything was connected at the skirt. If you're going to make this dress, one thing I definitely recommend is to make the pocket bags and openings an inch longer. They're a little tight as they are. Thanks for watching my tutorials or sew-alongs or whatever you want to call these videos. I hope you've learned some new techniques and you're inspired to try something you've never done before on your next project. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next week with a new project to get you in the mood for Halloween.